"Daddy, please bail out my nanny. She didn't do anything wrong." The little girl's voice didn't waver. Alexander Kane, a man who had never flinched in a boardroom, never softened in a negotiation, never once chosen feeling over fact, felt something crack open in his chest. His 6-year-old daughter Lily stood between him and the officers, her small hand gripping his sleeve like an anchor. Across the room, red and blue lights pulsed through the tall windows, painting the walls of his dining room in cold, frantic color. Papers lay scattered across the mahogany table. A phone buzzed unanswered, and in the center of it all, Maya, pale, still, terrified, stood with her hands being guided behind her back, a serving tray lying where it had fallen at her feet. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. What no one in that room understood, not the officers, not the lawyers, not the journalists already gathering outside the iron gates, was that a 6-year-old girl's quiet plea was about to unravel one of the most dangerous conspiracies in the city. It would expose betrayal inside a billion-dollar empire, resurrect a dead man's unfinished truth, and force the most guarded man alive to do the one thing he had sworn never to do again: trust someone. But to understand how a nanny ended up in handcuffs inside Alexander Kane's home, and why his daughter defended her with more conviction than any lawyer in the room, you have to go back to the beginning, back to when everything in this family first went quiet. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Alexander Kane did not need to be introduced. His name did that for him. At 41, he controlled 3 private equity firms, a logistics network spanning 4 continents, and a reputation that made CFOs sweat before the first slide of any presentation. Business journals called him surgical. Competitors called him something less printable. The city simply called him Kane, one word, the way you say a weather warning. He had built all of it deliberately, methodically, without sentiment. But on a Tuesday evening, 3 years before any of this, before Maya, before the arrest, before the moment that would shock an entire city, Alexander Kane sat alone at the head of a dining table built for 12, eating a reheated meal he hadn't tasted, staring at an empty chair across from him. The chair where his wife used to sit. She was gone, and he had never found a way to explain that to the little girl down the hall who still sometimes set a place for her mother at breakfast. That was the version of Alexander Kane that Maya Cole walked into. Not the empire, not the reputation, not the man on the magazine covers. She walked into the silence, and somehow, without trying, she began to fill it. Maya Cole arrived on a Monday morning with a single bag, a folder of references nobody had properly read, and the kind of quiet that doesn't ask permission to enter a room. Mrs. Hargrove, the housekeeper, showed her around with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this too many times. 7 nannies in 3 years. She didn't say it out loud, but the number lived in every tight smile she offered. "Lily's room is the 3rd on the left," she said. "Breakfast is at 7:30. Mr. Kane leaves by 8. He prefers not to be disturbed before then." Maya nodded and asked no questions. She found Lily sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by building blocks arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. The little girl didn't look up. "I don't need a nanny," Lily said flatly. "Okay," Maya replied. She sat down on the floor a few feet away and said nothing else. Lily waited for the correction, the negotiation, the cheerful redirection that every other nanny had tried. None came. After a long silence, she glanced sideways. Maya was simply sitting there, looking at the blocks. "Those are sorted by weight," Lily said finally, suspicious. "Not color." "I noticed," Maya said. "That's smarter, actually." Lily said nothing, but she didn't leave. The first week was a study in testing. Lily refused meals, gave one-word answers, and once locked the playroom door from the inside for 40 minutes to see what Maya would do. Maya sat on the floor in the hallway and waited. When the door finally opened, Lily peered out, expression unreadable. "You didn't call my dad," she said. "You weren't in danger," Maya said simply. "You just needed some space." Lily stared at her for a long moment. Then she walked back inside without a word. But she left the door open. At night, after Lily was asleep, Maya would slip into the small staff room at the end of the hall, close the door carefully, and transfer money, small amounts but consistent, from her account to another. She never explained it to anyone. Nobody thought to ask. Once her phone buzzed while she was checking Lily's homework. She glanced at the screen, and something crossed her face, not fear exactly, but the particular stillness of someone choosing, very deliberately, not to react. She declined the call, set the phone face down, returned her attention to the page in front of her. "You stopped," Lily observed, watching her. "I'm back now," Maya said quietly. "Where were we?" Lily pointed to the page, but her eyes stayed on Maya a moment longer than before. It happened slowly, the way light returns after a long winter, not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable degrees. First, Lily started answering in full sentences. Then she started asking questions about clouds, about whether fish dreamed, about why elevators had mirrors inside them. Maya answered every single one with the same steady attention, as though there was nowhere else she needed to be. By the third week, Lily laughed. It was small, a surprised, involuntary sound that escaped during a board game Maya had quietly introduced one evening. Lily clapped a hand over her mouth immediately, as if she'd broken a rule she hadn't known she was following. Maya didn't make a production of it. She just smiled and moved her piece on the board. But something had shifted. They both felt it. Alexander came home early on a Thursday. He would say later, to no one because he didn't discuss such things, that he had left the office ahead of schedule due to a canceled meeting. That was true. What was also true was that he had been doing it more often lately, without fully examining why. He heard the laughter before he reached the top of the stairs. Lily's laughter, genuine and unguarded, the kind he hadn't heard since before. He stopped the thought before it completed itself. He stood in the hallway outside the sitting room and listened. Through the half-open door he could see them. Lily on her stomach across the rug, head propped in both hands, talking animatedly about something. Maya beside her, listening in that particular way she had, completely still, completely present. Alexander watched for longer than he intended. He left before either of them saw him. At dinner 2 evenings later, Lily leaned toward him mid-meal, cupped her hand to his ear and whispered something. Alexander went very still. Across the table, Maya kept her eyes on her plate, the way a person does when they are being careful not to overhear. But she caught the moment he sat back in his chair, the almost imperceptible change in his expression. Not softness exactly, something closer to recalculation. He looked at Maya for just a beat longer than necessary, then cleared his throat and asked Lily about her reading assignment. Lily answered cheerfully, completely satisfied with whatever reaction she had produced. That night, after the house settled into silence, A sound drifted through the tall windows, distant, rhythmic, growing faintly louder before fading again. Police sirens far away. Maya stood at her window for a moment, very still. Then she drew the curtain closed. The folder lived at the bottom of her bag, beneath a change of clothes and a worn paperback she hadn't opened in weeks. Maya never left it in her room, never left it anywhere she couldn't reach it quickly. Old habit, one her father had taught her without meaning to, simply by the way he had lived. Careful, watchful, always ready to move. He had been wrong to think that would save him. She had been 12 when it started, old enough to understand that her father came home some nights with the particular tension of a man carrying something too heavy to name, young enough to believe, for a long time, that it would eventually be put down. Daniel Cole had worked in the financial compliance division of Hargrove Vance Corp for 11 years. He was quiet, precise, and deeply principled, qualities that had served him well, right up until the moment they made him dangerous to the wrong people. He had found something in the numbers, patterns too deliberate to be errors, transfers routed through shell accounts, cycling back through legitimate holdings before settling offshore, clean on the surface, irreversible underneath. He had documented everything. He was dead within a year, ruled an accident, case closed. Maya had kept the files. She hadn't come to the Kane household by coincidence. She had come because the same financial architecture her father had traced, the same routing signatures, the same layered accounts ran, in part, through a subsidiary connected to Kane Equity Group. She didn't believe Alexander was involved. The patterns suggested he was being used, not directing. But somewhere inside his business network, someone was still running the same operation that had killed her father. She needed proximity. She needed time. What she hadn't planned for was Lily. She sat on the edge of her bed one evening, the folder open across her knees, a hand-annotated spreadsheet balanced on top. Numbers her father had circled in red ink years ago. Numbers she had updated herself carefully over the months since. Her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her jaw tighten. Unknown secured line. She had been avoiding this call for 2 weeks. Whoever was on the other end knew she was close to something. They had reached out 3 times now, not with threats but with warnings, which, in her experience, were simply threats delivered more politely. She declined it again. Pressed the folder closed. Down the hall, she could hear Lily humming softly to herself, some small, tuneless song that had become a recent habit. Maya sat with that sound for a moment. Then she opened the folder again. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening. Lily was at the dining table working through a math worksheet, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth, the way it always was when she concentrated. Maya sat across from her, correcting quietly, suggesting rather than instructing. The chandelier cast warm light across the room. Dinner was cooling in the kitchen. Then the gates buzzed. Then buzzed again, then didn't stop. Mrs. Hargrove's voice came through the intercom, clipped and strange. "Mr. Kane, there are officers at the gate, several of them." Alexander appeared from his study, just as the front doors opened. They came in fast and formal, 4 officers and 2 men in dark suits, who moved with the particular authority of people who had paperwork to back up everything they were about to do. One of them held a document at his side like a weapon being kept briefly holstered. Maya Cole. Maya stood slowly from the table. Lily looked up. "We have a warrant for your arrest. charges of embezzlement and financial fraud tied to accounts associated with Hargrove Vance Corp. The room went completely still. One of the suited men stepped forward and placed a folder on the table: bank records, transaction histories, documents bearing Maya's name and signature across multiple pages. Clean, organized, damning. "These are fabricated," Maya said. Her voice was steady, just barely. "You'll have an opportunity to say that to a judge." Lily didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood the handcuffs. She understood the way Maya's face had gone pale and careful, the way she was holding herself very still in the manner of someone fighting hard not to fall apart in front of a child. "Maya," Lily's voice cracked. "It's okay," Maya said quietly, looking directly at her. "It's going to be okay." It was the wrong thing to promise. They both knew it. Lily turned and ran, not away but toward her father. She grabbed his sleeve with both hands, and when she looked up at him, her face was open in a way it almost never was. Unguarded, desperate. "Daddy, please bail out my nanny." Her voice trembled but didn't break. She didn't do anything wrong. The room held its breath. The officers waited. The lawyers waited. Mrs. Hargrove stood frozen in the doorway. Even the two suited men paused, watching Alexander Kane's face for the reaction they expected, the measured, liability-conscious response of a man who had not survived this long by making emotional decisions. Alexander looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Maya. He said nothing. And in that silence, everyone waited to find out who he actually was. His lawyer reached him before the police car had cleared the gate. Marcus Webb had been Alexander's legal counsel for 9 years. He was precise, unsentimental, and had earned his retainer many times over by being the voice Alexander listened to when every other voice was noise. He spoke quickly, quietly, with the measured urgency of someone who understood exactly how fast a situation could compound. "Alexander, listen carefully. Whatever you're thinking, don't. The moment you involve yourself financially in her release, you become part of the story. The media will connect you to the fraud. The board will have questions by morning. You have a shareholder meeting in 11 days. Alexander said nothing. "She was living in your home. That's already a problem. Distance is the only move right now. Let the legal process." "What did Lily say to me at dinner?" Alexander said. 2 weeks ago, do you remember?" Marcus paused. "What?" "She whispered something to me. You weren't there." Alexander watched the last flicker of red and blue disappear down the drive. "She told me Maya was the first person who had ever waited for her." Silence on the line. "That's not a legal argument," Marcus said finally. "No," Alexander agreed, "it is." He hung up. He made 3 calls in the following hour. His bail bondsman, his personal attorney, not Marcus, and a private investigator he had used twice before and trusted completely. Then he walked into the kitchen where Mrs. Hargrove was standing with her hands folded, expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had strong opinions and had decided, wisely, not to share them. "Prepare the bail," he said. She blinked. "Sir." "Tonight." By morning it was everywhere. Kane bails out arrested nanny, loyalty or liability. Ran on 3 financial news sites before 8 a.m. His phone produced notifications in clusters, like small detonations. 2 board members called before he reached the office. A business partner in Geneva sent a 3-line message that was professionally worded and deeply disapproving. Alexander read none of it. He sat at his desk and looked at a photograph Lily had drawn the previous month, slightly lopsided figures in crayon, labeled in her careful 6-year-old handwriting. Daddy, me, Maya. He hadn't moved it, hadn't thought much about why. He thought about it now. He had built an empire on calculated decisions, on removing sentiment from the equation before the equation could be compromised. It had made him formidable. It had also made him, for a long time, very alone. For once, he had chosen differently. He wasn't sure yet if it was wisdom or foolishness. But for the first time in years, the uncertainty didn't feel entirely unwelcome. He didn't tell anyone he was looking. That was deliberate. 9 years of running a company had taught Alexander that the moment you announced an investigation, whatever you were looking for had a way of disappearing. So he said nothing to Marcus, nothing to his board, nothing to the 2 executives who had called twice each, wanting reassurance he had no intention of providing. He simply gave Daniel Rourke, his private investigator, one instruction. Start with the documents they presented at the arrest. Work backwards. Rourke came back in 4 days with an expression Alexander had seen on him only once before, carefully neutral, the face of a man organizing difficult information before releasing it. The transaction records are real, he said, setting a folder on the desk. The accounts exist. The transfers happened. He paused. But the signature timestamps don't match her employment history. 3 of the 7 transactions were processed on dates she was verifiably elsewhere, one while she was at Lily's school recital. We have the attendance record. Alexander opened the folder. Someone built this case using real financial infrastructure, Rourke continued. They didn't fabricate money moving. They fabricated her moving it. Alexander turned a page, then another. The routing patterns were familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place, layered, precise, cycling through intermediary accounts before settling. He had seen architecture like this before in due diligence reports, in audits he had signed off on without looking closely enough. His jaw tightened. Where does the money actually originate? Rourke turned to a specific page and pointed. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. That's a subsidiary of Kane Equity, he said. Yes. I didn't authorize any of these transfers. No, Rourke said, you didn't. He pulled the internal financial records himself that evening after his floor had emptied. Didn't delegate it. Didn't explain the after-hours access to anyone. What he found took him 2 hours to fully trace and another hour to accept. The operation had been running for at least 3 years. Money cycling through legitimate Kane holdings, clean enough to survive a standard audit, complex enough to require someone with deep internal access and a detailed understanding of the company's financial architecture. This wasn't an outside attack. Someone inside his organization had been using his empire as a laundry. And Maya Cole, quiet, careful Maya, with her worn paperback and her secret late-night transfers and her phone calls she never answered, hadn't been stealing from anyone. She had been trying to prove exactly what he was now looking at. He sat back in his chair. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. Alexander Kane stared at the screen and began to understand how badly he had misread everything. The name at the center of everything was Richard Calloway. Chief Operating Officer, 12 years with Kane Equity. The kind of man who remembered birthdays, who stayed late visibly and left early quietly, who had a reputation for loyalty so consistent it had never once occurred to Alexander to question it. That, Alexander understood now, had been the point. Rourke laid it out methodically across 2 hours. The full architecture, reconstructed from financial records, internal communications, and documents that Maya had apparently been assembling for the better part of a year. Calloway had built the operation incrementally, the way careful people build dangerous things, slowly enough that no single change triggered an alarm. He had used Kane Equity's subsidiary network as a transit system for money originating from 3 illegal offshore arrangements. Arms procurement contracts routed through shell companies, regulatory payments that never reached their destinations. The numbers, totaled across 3 years, were considerable enough to make Alexander's chest feel tight when Rourke said them aloud. He needed the Kane name, Rourke said simply. Clean reputation, complex enough holdings that the patterns would be buried, and a CEO who trusted his COO enough not to look. Alexander said nothing. He had trusted him, completely, had defended Calloway in board meetings, had given him expanded oversight 2 years ago, had once told a journalist that Richard Calloway was the most reliable person in the organization. He sat with that for a moment. Maya's father had found the same trail 11 years earlier, working from the compliance division of Hargrove Vance, one of Calloway's earlier operations, before he had moved into Kane's orbit. Daniel Cole had documented it carefully, reported it internally, and then died in a car accident on a wet Wednesday evening before anyone with authority had been required to respond. Case closed, file archived, operation continued. Maya had grown up knowing what her father had found. She had spent years learning enough, accounting, corporate law, financial forensics, to finish what he had started. The nanny position hadn't been coincidence. It had been the closest she could get to the inside of the network without triggering attention. She had been 3 weeks from having enough to go to the authorities when they arrested her. Alexander stood at his office window for a long time after Rourke left. Below, the city operated with its usual indifference. Traffic, movement, the ordinary machinery of 10,000 people going about their evening. He had built something real, something he had believed was clean. And someone had stood quietly inside it for 12 years, using his name, his reputation, and his trust as cover for everything he would have found unforgivable. Meanwhile, a woman with a worn paperback and a folder hidden in the bottom of her bag had been trying, at considerable personal risk, to stop it. He reached for his phone. It was time to finish what Maya's father had started. Richard Calloway was arrested on a Thursday morning. Alexander had given everything to the Financial Crimes Unit, Rourke's reconstruction, Maya's original documentation, 3 years of internal records pulled and organized over 4 consecutive late nights. It was thorough enough that the lead investigator had called it, quietly, the most complete corporate fraud package she had received in 14 years on the job. The arrest happened at the office. Alexander had made sure of that. He watched it from across the floor, Calloway in his usual suit, his usual composed expression, right up until the moment it wasn't usual anymore. Right up until the moment he saw Alexander watching and understood completely that the loyalty he had spent 12 years exploiting had finally run out. He said nothing. There was nothing useful left to say. Maya's charges were dropped within the week. The official statement cited fabricated evidence, manipulated records, and a coordinated effort to obstruct a legitimate whistleblower investigation. Her name appeared in 3 financial publications by the following Monday, not as a defendant, but as the woman who had spent years quietly reconstructing what her father had died trying to expose. She read the articles once, then set her phone down and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the day. Alexander came to her the evening after the charges were formally dismissed. He didn't call ahead. He found her in the garden, sitting on the low stone bench where she sometimes went after Lily was asleep. The evening was cool and still. He sat down, not across from her, beside her, that detail she would think about later. "I had every resource available to me," he said. "I could have looked sooner. I chose to believe the easier version of events." He paused. "I should have trusted you." Maya was quiet for a moment. "You trusted Lily," she said finally. "That was enough." They found Lily in the hallway. She had, predictably, not been asleep at all. She looked between them with the focused assessment of a child who has learned to read rooms carefully. Then something in her face released, like a breath held too long, and she smiled, wide and unguarded and completely unself-conscious. She crossed to Maya first and held on without saying anything. Then she turned to her father. "She's staying," Lily said. Not a question, a statement directed at Alexander with calm 6-year-old certainty. Then softer, "Right." Alexander looked at Maya. Maya looked back at him. "She's not going anywhere," he said. The house that had been quiet for 3 years filled, in that moment, with something it had almost forgotten how to hold. Warmth, simply that. And this time, nobody drew the curtain closed.